Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Now we come to the last two of the Deutero-Pauline letters, the two letters that have been attributed to St. Paul, but which we believe were not written by St. Paul, and that's 1 Timothy and 2 Timothy. Why is 1 Timothy first? Because
It's the longest one.
it's longer. That is the only reason 1 Timothy is first, because whoever arranged the Bible found two letters to Timothy and had to figure out which one we're going to put first and which one we're going to put second. Put the longest one first. Does 1 Timothy talk about 2 Timothy or vice versa? Do they acknowledge that more than one letter has been sent? In 2 Timothy, for instance, are we saying, oh, when I wrote you before? What's interesting is that there's no acknowledgement in either letter of the other. So it could be the case that they were written by two different people, or it could be the case that, well, we don't know what the case is. We just know that we don't know the existence of one letter from the other. So neither letter speaks of the other letter. In order for us to understand a bit about the context of the letter, it's probably important for us to know who Timothy was. So we talked about Titus and a bit of where it is that we find Titus in Paul's letters and what it is that the letter of Titus says about Titus. So let's do the same with Timothy. First of all, who was Timothy? Timothy lived in Lystra in Southeast Asia Minor and was presumably converted by Paul around the year 46 A.D., and then when Paul passed through Lystra again around 50 A.D., about 4 years later, Timothy joined him. So it seems to be the case that Timothy heard Paul the first time he came to town, and then 4 years later when Paul came back to town, reconnected with him again, and this time when Paul set out, he set out with Paul. And it seems that Timothy was one who remained beside Paul from the time that he left Lystra then, during that second trip in 50 A.D. It seems that he was with Paul throughout the rest of his time. So in terms of chronology again, we say Jesus died around the year 30. Around the year 50 was when Paul passed through Lystra for the second time. 46 was the first time. 50 was the second time. So from 50 until Paul's death, somewhere between 63 and 67, for those 13 to 17 years, it seems that Timothy was a companion and friend of Paul. So, Acts chapter 16 suggests that Timothy's mother was a Jewish Christian, so she was part of the circumcision group. But Timothy's father, what was his background? Was he a Jewish Christian as well? No, he was a Gentile. And so, was Timothy circumcised as a kid? No, because his father was a Gentile, and even though his mother was a Jewish Christian, he was not circumcised as a child. But what happened, according to Acts chapter 16, Paul came to Derbe and then to Lystra, which is, of course, where Timothy was from, where a disciple named Timothy lived, whose mother was Jewish and a believer, but whose father was a Greek. The believers at Lystra and Iconium spoke well of Timothy. Paul wanted to take Timothy along on the journey, so Paul circumcised Timothy because of the Jews who lived in that area, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. So you can imagine that question coming up of all of these Jews. Paul is circumcised. He was a Jew, so there's no problem with Paul. But when you're preaching to other Jews, the question is going to come up, wait a minute, wasn't your father a Greek? Are you one of us? Are you circumcised? Will they ever know?
No, I am.
Well, in order not to scandalize the Jews, according to this story then, Timothy was circumcised. So when Paul set out then from Lystra in 50 A.D., we have Timothy accompanying Paul. This was what we call Paul's second missionary journey. We often talk about Paul's 3 missionary journeys. So Timothy joined Paul on his second journey in 50 A.D. They traveled up through Phrygia and Galatia to Europe and visited the cities of Philippi, Thessalonica, and Beroea. Timothy was then sent back to strengthen the Thessalonians, and he rejoined Paul in Corinth, bringing Paul the good news, so that Timothy's name was joined to Paul's in the sending of 1 Thessalonians. That first ever letter that was written around 50 to 51 AD. How interesting. Now that Paul has met up with Timothy, Paul is sending the first letter to the Thessalonians, the first ever book written in the New Testament. He's sending it along with Timothy. Timothy joined Paul in evangelizing Corinth, according to the second letter to the Corinthians. But then after that, we lose track of Timothy when Paul goes back to Caesarea. Remember that Caesarea is near Jerusalem in the Holy Land. Paul goes back to Caesarea, Jerusalem, and Syrian Antioch, and there's no mention of Timothy in any of those journeys. Where do we find Timothy again? When Paul is staying in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, during his third missionary journey, we hear that Timothy was with him for a time in Ephesus. And so Paul sent Timothy from Ephesus into Macedonia, modern-day Europe, with the understanding that Timothy would eventually go to Corinth. It seems that Timothy did arrive in Corinth, and it was at the time shortly after the time that the first letter of the Corinthians was received. So remember, the Corinthians were having these divisions, and Paul wrote them this stern letter talking about these divisions in the body of Christ. And so Timothy, it seems, arrived shortly after that. And did the people receive that letter very well? It doesn't seem so. So it doesn't seem that... So Timothy is just arriving in Corinth after they received this letter from Paul. It was not so kind. And here now is a friend of Paul. And so the friend of Paul, Timothy, runs back to Paul in Ephesus, in modern-day Turkey, to let Paul know, oh, by the way, that letter that you wrote to the Corinthians, they didn't take that so well. When Paul left Ephesus in the summer of 57, Timothy was probably with him. And then we remember Titus, whom we just mentioned before. Titus brought the good news of how the reconciliation took place in Corinth. So Titus is coming back from Corinth with that good news. And then after that, Paul and Timothy send the second letter to the Corinthians from Macedonia. And so in the second letter to the Corinthians then, we're going to see how it is that it's sent from both Paul and Timothy. Paul writes, Paul, an apostle of Christ by the will of God, and Timothy, our brother, to the church of God in Corinth. It seems that Timothy spent the winter of 57 to 58 with Paul in Corinth. They wintered there that year. That was the time at which Paul wrote the letter to the Romans. And then in the Acts of the Apostles, suggest that Timothy set out from Corinth to Jerusalem with Paul. So now they're setting out from Corinth and going back to Jerusalem. But it suggests that Timothy went on ahead of Paul and was waiting for Paul in Troas. And that is the last mention that we have of Timothy in the Acts of the Apostles. We know that Timothy left Corinth with Paul to go to Jerusalem. And then at one point he went ahead to Troas. But after that, there's no other mention of Timothy in the book of the Acts of the Apostles, which was written by Luke. Timothy, interestingly though, is listed as the co-sender of 4 different letters that were written by Paul. And so of these 7 letters, Timothy is the co-sender of the first letter to the Thessalonians, of the letter to the Philippians, of the letter to Philemon, and also the first letter to the Corinthians. So 4 of the 7 were written in the names of both Paul and Timothy. Another book, if we were to read it, also lists Timothy as the co-sender, but it's the book of the letter to the Colossians. Was Colossians written by Paul? We don't believe that it was, but it mentions how it is that Paul is sending this letter with Timothy. So what did Paul think of Timothy? If Paul wrote of Timothy in different letters, and if Paul sent 4 letters with Timothy as the co-sender, and Paul mentions Timothy in various letters, what did Paul say of Timothy? Did Paul like Timothy? Did he say good things about him? Yeah, or not? I suspect he did. Paul called Timothy his brother and God's servant in the gospel of Christ. That was in his first letter to the Thessalonians. And then in the letter to the Philippians, Paul says, I have no one like Timothy. He describes him as a son to Paul in the service of the gospel, looking after Christ's interests rather than his own. So that was 1 Thessalonians and Philippians. In the first letter to the Corinthians as well, Paul Paul describes Timothy as his beloved and faithful child, not to be despised since he does the work of the Lord. So that's how Paul describes Timothy in Paul's letters. Now the question becomes, how does the writer who writes in Paul's name describe Timothy in 1st and 2nd Timothy? That is, does he say some of the same sorts of things, or does he say different things? The first letter to Timothy describes Timothy as a beloved son to Paul and a servant to God. We've heard that before. He's to be an example even as he learned from Paul, and he's not to be despised from the people. So in the same way that he learned from Paul to be an example, Paul was his example, and now he's supposed to be an example for others. The first letter to Timothy also describes Timothy as a young man who seems to have had a gift which was given to him through prophecy with the laying on of hands of the presbyters. So it seems that in that time, they believed in diaconate ordination and presbyter ordinations. Today we have the laying on of hands. If we remember that at Deacon John's ordination, it was a way for those who are ordained to be able to ask that God send God's Spirit down on him as he begins his ministry as a deacon. In the same way, that the first century belief was that laying on of hands, the laying on of hands and the sharing of the Spirit, that somehow Timothy, through the laying on of hands by the elders or presbyters of the community, that he received a certain gift. Chapter 5, verse 23 suggests that he was subject to frequent illness, though it doesn't say what. And what's interesting about the first letter to Timothy is that there's also other information that doesn't fit with the Acts of the Apostles or with Paul's letters, which raises all sorts of questions with respect to the inspiration. Many people believe that God wrote the Bible, that it's almost like the people who were writing the Bible were almost in some sort of trance and that God was writing the Bible through them. Well, then how do you reconcile information, for instance, information in the first letter to Timothy that's contrary to what we read in Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles? What are some examples? How it is that it says that Timothy was left in Ephesus by Paul when Paul went to Macedonia, hoping to return to Ephesus soon. So there are different details. All that simply say there are different details here in the letters to Timothy that can't be right if Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles are right. Somewhere the Bible is wrong, whether that's the first letter to Timothy or whether that's Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles. The first letter to Timothy begins with an opening formula, which is virtually the same as Titus, which is why some people have believed that perhaps the same author wrote the two of them. And then, similar to Titus, the author of this first letter to Timothy also goes into church order and church structure. It seems that in chapter 5, verses 19 to 20, there's a process at Ephesus, or they're proposing a process at Ephesus, for bringing accusations against the presbyter. So this raises an interesting question, because now that we have these overseers and these presbyters and these deacons in the early church, what do you do if someone has an accusation against one of them? For instance, we saw all of those disqualifiers there in the book of Titus, that they should not be a heavy drinker. What do you have now when someone is accusing someone of one of those disqualifiers? He's a heavy drinker. What do we do with that? And so it seems to be setting up those processes then in Ephesus for how to deal with those. Simply suggesting then that these had been in place for some time now. And now it was time to help to address, what do we do with when there are accusations that are brought against people in those positions. We find in chapter 3, verses 1 to 7, stipulations for bishops. Here is a trustworthy saying, says chapter 3, verse 1. Whoever aspires to be an overseer desires a noble task. How interesting. It almost sets up these overseers as somehow being a task more noble, doing a task more noble than that of the presbyters. A noble task, setting the overseers up in a way different from the presbyters. Now the overseer is to be above reproach, faithful to his wife, temperate, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not given to drunkenness, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. Aren't these many of the same qualities that we saw in the letter to Titus? He must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him, and he must do so in a manner worthy of full respect. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, how can he take care of God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become conceited and fall under the same judgment as the devil. May not become conceited. It almost gives us this idea that the overseers were this noble task, where once you got into this position of this noble task of overseeing the community, of being a bishop, that it could be a temptation to fall into conceit. Oh, look at me. He must also have a good reputation with outsiders so that he will not fall into disgrace and into the devil's trap. And then, in this first letter of Timothy, we continue with deacons, and then with deaconesses in a moment. First, deacons. In the same way, deacons are to be worthy of respect, sincere, not indulging in much wine, and not pursuing dishonest gain. They must keep hold of the deep truths of the faith with a clear conscience. They must first... Good question, good question. Chapter 3, verses 8 to 10.
They like the wine. They like the wine now.
Verses 3, 8 to 10. Lock up the wine, not indulging in much wine. We're up to, that's chapter 3, verses 8 to 10. We were up to verse 10. They must first be tested. That is interesting. That's the first case of all three ministries. Deacons are the only ones who, according to the first letter to Timothy, should be tested in some way. Yikes, it's too late, Deacon John. We should have come up with a test.
I don't know that.
Question?
The reason I was saying that is because that question arose to me while we were out there. Then I was invited by an old friend, good friend, and I said, well, maybe we can stop by and go have a drink. Or are you able to drink now, or they don't let you drink no more?
Excellent question. So the Catholic position, so there are different views on the issue.
What?
From some non-Catholic Christians, like Baptists, especially of certain sects within the Baptist church, there's absolutely no wine, and various indulgences, that there's to be none of it. The Catholic stance has always been one of moderation. Una vez al año no hace daño, right? Once in a while. I mean, the biggest concern is whether we're causing scandal to people through our words and actions. And so we want to avoid things that cause scandal. And all that depends on people's perceptions, right? The stories are told of one priest in a church not too far from here who back in the 70s went to bars and danced with the women. And in the 1970s, this was the early 70s, this was so scandalous.
Back in then, the 70s, how was that?
There you go. So, I mean, this was absolutely scandalous.
He was at the bars all the time. He would get pretty good. But he carried on in a nice way with everybody and all. But then somebody saw them and they mentioned it to the church.
So therein lies the challenge. I mean, on the one hand, we're all human beings, and that's a way to socialize and to be with other human beings.
Yeah.
On the other hand, what would happen if Father Jamie started drinking whatever drinks or shots or whatever and started to say things that were kind of embarrassing? Right,
That's only, as they say, if you can handle your drink. I mean, you can have a social drink or whatever, and that be fine as long as you don't go over the limit. In other words, right?
The Catholic position has always been one of moderation. Has been one of moderation.
And what about ours?
Which could be rooted in St. Paul, right? When I say Catholic, I mean American Catholic, Roman Catholic. Catholic positions have typically been that. So, I mean, when it says, for instance, of not indulging in much wine, that's certainly not the Baptist interpretation of no wine. Not indulging in much wine means, go ahead and have wine, but not indulging.
Don't come out there falling down.
Yeah. So we have there the qualities for deacons. Let them first be tested, and then if there is nothing against them, let them serve as deacons. Verse 10. Are we ready for deaconesses? Verse 11. In the same way, the women, deaconesses, are to be worthy of respect, not malicious talkers, but temperate and trustworthy in everything. In the same way, right? Women, there are certain things for men, there are certain things for women. And then it goes back to verse 12. A deacon must be faithful to his wife and must manage his children and his household well. Those who have served well gain an excellent standing and great assurance in their faith in Christ Jesus. So what is a deacon? We've talked more about the overseers. Epe is the root for over, skopos, seer. So the episkopos, singular, or episkopoi, plural, were the overseers of the church. The presbyters were the elders. The deacons, what root does deacon come from? The Greek word diakonein suggests service, which is why we often say that the deacons were the early table waiters at the Eucharist. It's more a service aspect than what the bishops and the presbyters may have provided. A more menial, taking care of some of the more menial tasks within the community. Like, remember in the Acts of the Apostles, we had that story of how it was that, so that the presbyters, the elders could dedicate themselves to prayer and teaching. The deacons were appointed to take care of feeding. We also come to some notes on widows. How it was that in Ephesus then, we had two types of widows, and one of them is lifted up as being more true, if you will, special widows. So the first letter to Timothy, chapter 5, this is verses 3 to 16. Give proper recognition to those widows who are really in need. And essentially what happens, we have a section here who, first of all, let's make sure that we understand, widows then are women who have lost their husbands to death. And so a widow, in order to be one of these special widows that's taken care of by the church, first of all, you have to be 60 years old. You have to be married only once, and thus committed to remaining single for the rest of your life, because remember that the ancient belief was that you're still committed to that man even beyond death. You can't have children or grandchildren to be cared for, so all of your children and grandchildren have to be raised so that they're not looking to you and counting on your support. Why would that be an issue for the church? That was a long-standing issue in the Roman church. Why? Because it's easy to take care of celibate men. Once you start adding girlfriends or wives and children, now as a church we have to be responsible for the college payments of the children. I mean, essentially, that's what non-Catholic Christian churches do. Baptists, Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians, we could go on and on and on. They find a way to support the pastor and his family in some way. In the Roman Catholic Church, there would always been a benefit of keeping priests celibate. Why? I mean, in terms of the fundraising model of the church, in terms of the sustainability of the church, it's just easier to have people who don't have children or grandchildren to be cared for. Other qualifications, those widows must have brought up their children well, and they must be well known for their good deeds. It seems that many of these widows were without personal wealth. They didn't have their own money. They didn't have lots of money themselves. And so what happened? The church provided for those widows. Those widows had a special job. What was their role within the community? Praying. They prayed day and night, extending hospitality even in menial tasks like washing the feet of the saints. The widows were there to help, and helping those in need. Can you see where a spirituality of nuns and religious sisters today might be rooted scripturally? In these widows. Nuns are not widows, but they are single women who do many of the tasks that we see mentioned here in works like the first letter to Timothy, dedicating themselves to prayer night and day and doing menial tasks, helping those in need. But the writer's tone toward other widows, we've talked before about how it was that in Paul's letters he esteems women more highly, saying there is no male or female. This is another Deutero-Pauline instance of how it was that women are not always respected. So that, for instance, it talks about how it is that the fear that we might have with younger widows is that they might become merry widows, indulging in pleasure and sensual desires rather than dedicating themselves to Christ. They might go about visiting and gossiping, looking for another husband, and thus breaking their lifelong pledge to their first husband. What does this writer say? I was about to say Paul, but we know that Paul didn't write it. What does this author of the first letter to Timothy say? It's better to remarry and have children than to be one of these merry young widows scandalizing the community. Yikes. As with the letter to Titus, we see the theme of false teaching. Again, similar to Titus, though, we don't know the error. We don't know what it is that people are saying. So there's an unclear reference to devotion to myths and genealogies. We see that in chapter 1, verse 4, and in chapter 4, verse 7. In chapter 1, verse 4, it says, to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogy, such things promote controversial speculations rather than advancing God's work, which is by faith. Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. Rather, train yourself to be godly. So there's nothing specific, so we don't know really what they're talking about, except for these suggestions of myths and genealogies and wives' tales. Perhaps it was the case that some people were forbidding others to marry, or insisting that they abstain from certain foods, because chapter 4, verse 3 talks about them saying they forbid people to marry, and they order them to abstain from certain foods. But again, which foods are they saying they have to abstain from? No indication. And then it also suggests that some were more interested in making money, so that, for instance, in chapter 6, they have been robbed of truth and who think that godliness is a means to financial gain. Yikes. So we have these references to these other teachers, these false teachers, but what specifically they're teaching, we'll never know. And then finally, in the first letter of Timothy, we have this other theme of community relations and belief. So what we'll notice here, for instance, in chapter 2, verses 9 to 12, we have instructions on worship, but who's going to have more instructions, the men or the women? The women. Verse 9, women, I also want the women to dress modestly, with decency and propriety, adorning themselves not with elaborate hairstyles, or gold, or pearls, or expensive clothes, but with good deeds, appropriate for women who profess to worship God. Instead of putting on all those gold and pearls, put on good deeds. Wow. Verse 11, a woman should learn in quietness and what? Full submission. I do not permit a woman to teach or to assume authority over a man. She must be quiet. For Adam was formed first. Look at this. We're going into a theological explanation now. We're going to come up with a reason, a theological or religious reason for women being submissive. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not the one deceived. It was the woman who was deceived and became a sinner. But women will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. So this view of women is nothing that we see in Paul's letters. How interesting that a later writer, whoever he or she was, we suspect it was a he, right, came along writing these things that we find in the house codes of Colossians and Ephesians, and now in works like the first letter to Timothy on women. It's a view of women that we don't find in Paul's letters. In his undisputed letters, he tells us, Galatians 3:28, there is no male or female. Can you imagine Paul writing something like this? And finally, in this first letter to Timothy, we find that famous saying in chapter 6, verse 10. It says, for the love of money is what? A root of all kinds of evil. Some people eager for money have wandered from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Money is the root of all evil. The letter concludes, begins to wind down. What's interesting is that it doesn't have the same conclusion as Titus or the second letter to Timothy. How interesting that the first letter to Timothy is very different, concluding with a passionate plea to Timothy. And that, in 6 chapters, was the first letter to Timothy.